In addition to its size, it's also relatively stable. So it's not the case that this gap just tends to emerge in specific electoral competitions when perhaps these issues happen to be more salient or not in different scenarios. So what we're looking at in these top two panels of this graph is the absolute probability to vote. This is based on self-reported probability on a kind of 0 to 10 scale question that individuals have. On the left, we have heterosexual individuals. On the right, we have LGBT voters. And we can see that there's a significant asymmetry between these two different groups. Amongst heterosexuals, the kind of centre-left and centre-right-wing parties, it's essentially a coin toss between who happens to be in the lead at a certain time. Whereas if we look at the graph on the right, there's a significant premium for the Labour Party, that's the centre-left in red, a slight majority for the allegedly Liberal Party of Liberal Democrats. When we look at the bottom, this is the kind of relative probability to vote. So this is when you benchmark parties against the Conservative, the gap is essentially stable, right? Whilst there might be variation that takes place across the panel, these are individuals who are panelized, so we're observing the same individuals over time, i.e. this is within individual stability or change, largely stable across time, whereas for heterosexual individuals, they move on either side of the relative threshold compared to Conservative parties. So, whistle-stop tour to kind of try to convince you based on what's already out there and what I won't present later on that a gap between these two different social demographic groups exists. But today I want to talk to you about why. So largely we kind of have four, at least, different arguments to explain why there might be variation or political distinctiveness between queer individuals and non-queer individuals when it comes to their electoral preferences, particularly at the ballot box, but also just attitudinal variables as well. The one I'm going to show you via experiments is the kind of spatial model, which I'll summarize in a second. But there are kind of three other alternatives that I'm going to briefly summarize, but not consider later on in this talk. So in reverse order, there's an argument of political sorting. I absolutely hate this argument, but as a good scientist, I have to come and present that this argument exists out there as well. So rather than theorizing that queer individuals have different electoral preferences because of their queer identities, this argument argues that individuals have queer identities because they come from different political backgrounds, i.e., I'm not left because I'm queer because I'm left. Now, this paper is published called Identity as Dependent Variable. I hate this paper, but it's in a well-respected journal, so we have to talk about it. Importantly, the authors also argue that the same relation takes place for race, i.e. if you were born a white Democrat, but you really identify strongly with the Democrats, later on in your life, you're going to say you're African American or Latino because you change your identity, according to this argument, because of your political preferences. Hopefully, I've been able to kind of make my strong rejection of this argument quite clear. Other argument is about acculturation. Now, I posted this post on Twitter in the summer, or Blue Sky, I can't remember which one it was, which says queers and cis heterosexual individuals live in parallel universes. And this was because this song by Post Malone was rated the #1 song of the summer in 2024. I'd never heard of the song. For me, the song of the summer was Apple by Charlie XCX or something by Chappell Roan. But I'm taking this as a kind of a classical example of individuals consume different culture, engage in different cultural activities, have different likes and taste likes. And as a function of these kind of different cultural activities that they engage in, they're likely going to have different values as well. This is a scene from Saturday Night Live, which is a very popular TV show in the United States that has these sitcoms about politicians. Here, they're kind of gaining in a parody against Hillary Clinton, but the character takes the wig off and underneath is rose petals. Does anyone know what this is a cultural reference to? It's from RuPaul's Drag Race, right? So, but there are lots of heterosexual individuals when they saw this being like, I don't get it. Like, they didn't get the joke. Again, there's another example about how there's different cultural values that these different groups engage in, which is likely to shape their likes and dislikes later on. The other kind of more psychological mechanism that explains their political distinctiveness is this idea of conversion. And essentially the idea here is that growing up in a heteronormative or patriarchal society, queer individuals are likely going to experience being othered when they're first developing their political or social identities. And this process of being othered is likely to result in their political preferences or beliefs being shaped in the same way that peers who don't have these experiences do. So imagine two brothers who grow up in the same socio-economic background. one of the brothers is queer, one of the other brothers isn't queer. Despite these symmetrical socioeconomic backgrounds, the experience of living as the othered individual is going to lead to different outcomes. And we know for a number of papers that queer individuals tend to score far more higher on issues like empathy, are far more likely to hold liberal values when it comes to socioeconomic welfare provision, have more liberal values when it comes to provision for migrants or asylum seekers, tapping into this idea of the shared underdog from the experience of being marginalized. Now, those three arguments I'm not going to talk about anymore. The one argument I want to talk about is the very simplistic rational choice spatial model, in which case individuals go to the political marketplace with a set of preferences that they want to gain or achieve, i.e., I'm a queer individual and it's illegal to be queer in my country. I want to be allowed to be queer. I'll vote for the political party that's most likely to provide that utility which I would maximize. What you're kind of seeing here on the right is a graph from Chapel Hill, expert survey of political party positions. On the y-axis is how much importance political parties place on the issue of LGBTQ plus rights. And on the x-axis is whether they are pro-left or anti-right. There's a curvilinear relationship here, which means that if you really love the gays or really hate the gays, you're likely to make, I'm being flippant in my language, I hope we can accept that I'm just being accessible, but they're more likely to make these issues salient, i.e. they're more likely to talk about these issues in their political campaigns, in their manifestos, in their press releases, whereas if you have a somewhat lukewarm position on this issue, or you don't want to talk about the issue at all, the salience is low. Which makes sense, right? If you're neither pro or anti, you don't want to talk about the issue because taking a position either way might provide you with some sort of electoral penalty because you have voters who might be with economically left-wing, but perhaps socially conservative or even EPC. But this is basically to show you that certain political party families, largely the parties of social democracy or parties on the left, are by definition more likely to have more liberal positions on these questions, and therefore we would expect queer voters to vote for these individual parties. This is data from Spain, looking at 2016 to 2019 in the political parties' positions on LGBT plus politics. Surprisingly, the space between political parties has not diminished over time, i.e. the level of dispersion or polarization in the party system on this question is potentially even greater now than it was in the past. But in terms of the theoretical argument, when we look at how voters behave, surprise, surprise, queer individuals are more likely to cast ballots for those parties that have pro-queer positions and more likely to penalize those parties that have negative queer positions. Perhaps interesting here is that the penalty for Vox and PP is essentially the same. Some might argue that's because, well, they're basically in some sort of ex-ante coalition with one another, participating in campaigns with one another. They have an associational relationship with one another, therefore they are tarred with the same brush when it comes to this position. I'm sure people remember there was a poster in La Plaza Pedro Loro which said, you know, if you vote for Feijóo, you're essentially voting for Abascal on this question as well. So observational data, some that I presented at the beginning of this talk and some that I presented specifically here, shows that there's a clear correlation between parties' positions, i.e. supply side on these issues, and voter preferences for parties that match these positions as well. Of course, voters have diverse preferences, right? And queer individuals are not from the same social demographic group in the population, i.e. there are rich gays and there are less rich gays. And how are these individuals going to behave, right? If voters really vote, queer voters really vote like their rights depend on it, or they want to maximize their queer welfare, they should give up some of their economic preferences to maximize their liberal preferences. i.e., you're a queer individual with lots of money and you don't want to pay any taxes. You should vote for an economically conservative party, right, who wants to reduce welfare, reduce taxes, and allow you to keep your money. That might come with costs in that you might have to vote for a party that has a reputation of being historically homophobic or actively engages in political rhetoric that is homophobic. So when we look at the kind of intersection between income and queer identification, we do know that both heterosexual and non-heterosexual individuals become less supportive of redistribution as income increases. So there is an effect on their preferences on economic dimensions. If, however, the slopes don't move at the same pace, right? No matter what group of income you are, queer individuals are more supporting of welfare, but the relationship still exists. When we look at voting intentions, however, they don't follow those economic incentives, i.e. as queer individuals become richer or are richer, because it's not panel, as queer individuals are higher on the income distribution, they are still more likely to vote left and don't follow these economic models, right? So they're still voting spatially like their rights depended on it, or like the right to vote for groups that are favourable towards their right positions, even in this cross-threshold scenario. That's the observational setup. That's what we know so far. Observational data, which is great. We need good, high-quality description to identify relationships that exist, also comes with certain drawbacks at certain times. So the first is that we were kind of initially told in the American voter model from the 1960s that there's a clear causal funnel. Individuals have social demographic characteristics. This leads to have different preferences, and then we vote for parties that match these preferences. We now know, however, that actually that's often not the case. We sometimes like political parties independent of the positions they have and actually adopt positions that reflect those that the parties advocate. Think about the issue like the European Union, for example. Lots of experimental studies have shown that individuals don't really know much about the European Union, so we just follow whatever their political party primes them on at certain times. So we have an endogeneity problem. What is driving what in terms of attitudes or preferences and party identities. There's a huge problem with queer voters having bundled issues. If I was to sample a poll, a random queer individual in the population, it's very likely that it will be very liberal on economic issues, very liberal on immigration issues, very liberal on European issues. So it's hard to tease out what policy preference or what attitudinal variable is driving their association with political parties, right? Because all these issues are correlated or bundled together. The final one is that in most problems of spatial voting models is motivated bias or projection. I believe that the PSOE is more liberal on queer politics because I like them, whereas actually their position might not be as good as I believe it is, right? So we believe parties are closer to us or further away from us based on our emotional or psychological attachment with them in general, right? In a perfect scenario, we should be able to like manipulate whether they are pro or anti and see spatially how that matches with our preferences. And that's what I'm going to do. So we have two different experiments that answer two different questions, which hopefully I'll be able to convince you explain part of the relationship in queer political distinctiveness. Now, I want to make clear that I presented four different models about why individuals have different preferences. And I believe that social science shouldn't, and indeed empirically can't, identify monocausal relationships. So whilst the rest of my the presentation today is going to be about this spatial model, I'm not saying that this model trumps all the alternative explanations that exist, but rather this is just a kind of complementary component that explains some of that diversification. So the first question I have is that if queer individuals are voting for these political parties because of their pro-LGBT+ positions, individuals should infer that candidates that come from these parties are more likely to vote favourably on these issues than against, right? Even in the absence of information explicitly about this policy position, the party brand or the label associated with that candidate and their reputation should infer whether we view them as pro or anti or not, right? The second question is that individuals, when they're informed, when they're given explicit information signals, should update their preferences based whether that information is congruent or incongruent with the prior they had about a particular party. So say, for example, I'm really emotionally or psychologically attached to the PSOE. I believe that the PSOE is probably going to engage in pro-environmental policies, but then I'm exposed to information that actually tells me that the PSOE is going to provide a large number of licenses to new coal mines, to new oil drilling, right? I'm going to have to update my assumption about the kind of pro-environmental credentials of the PSOE at a certain time. So far, so good? Mm-hmm. What we do in this experiment is look at within individual change. So we kind of panelize respondents to see when we randomly expose them to information, how they update their ideas. So the first experiment is a conjoint. The outcome variable is the perceived position of MPs on LGBTQ+ policy positions. And the core attribute we're interested in is the brand, because we want to know if individuals assume that individual MPs from parties have certain positions, but we also include a large number of additional attributes that are simultaneously randomized. Importantly, we include the MP's voting record on a number of economic and cultural dimensions. I should say that this is done in the UK, where party discipline is very weak, i.e. on issues like Gaza, on issues like Brexit, on issues like immigration, within political parties, it's very reasonable for MPs to have very varied preferences. Indeed, when we look at the data on same-sex marriage vote in the UK, there's a huge number of Labour MPs who voted against and a large number of Conservative MPs who voted for, right? So people don't necessarily are not accustomed to having MPs who have varied positions on different issues. The subgroup variable of interest, of course, is whether they identify as queer. People often ask, how do you identify queer individuals? So it's a two-step process. In the survey, we ask about sexual orientation. So do you identify as heterosexual, straight, or lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual? And then for the trans, it's a two-step process. We ask about the gender they identify with. We also ask about the sex they were assigned at birth. If these don't match, they're then presented with a prompt that says, your sex assigned at birth and the gender identity you operate with today aren't the same. Is this because you identify as trans? Was this a mistake? Or do you identify with some other identity that might explain the variation in the two? The second experiment is a classic vignette. We basically, although it has a within individual design, we essentially randomly expose individuals to information about political parties in the absence of LGBTQ plus positions and ask respondents' voting intentions for them. In a second stage, we then randomize them to information on the same MP, but inform them whether the position was pro or anti the position and look at within individual change between time. I'll show you this in a graphic in a second, which will make it more intuitive. The prompt for the conjoint is essentially this. For the next couple of minutes, we're going to be showing you a number of different MP bios, and you'll be asked to consider whether you view the views of this MP to be pro or anti-LGBT plus rights. For an individual respondent, the question was always phrased in the same direction. So say the question said, which one of these MPs is more likely to be pro LGBTQ+, in which case all of the iterations you did were positively framed, but individuals were randomly assigned to a positively framed or negatively framed question in case individuals have asymmetric responses, which they do, i.e. they're more likely to react strongly when the question is negatively phrased as opposed to positively phrased. This is an example of what the conjoint looks like. Of largest theoretical interest to us is, like, apart from the party, how the individual MP has voted on a number of salient economic and cultural questions at a certain time.
So, sorry, this is embedded in an online survey.
In an online survey.
For a representative sample of the UK population?
Yeah, this is a representative sample of the UK. It's about 2,000 respondents. We don't have a sample booster for queer individuals in the conjoint because conjoints by definition provide huge amount of power because 2,000 respondents could lead to 40,000 observations. In the vignette, which I'll present after this, we did have a purpose-built booster sample of queer individuals to have the power in the vignette setting. Okay, so this is the results from the conjoint experiment. Perhaps unsurprisingly, but congruent with the theory, is that individuals clearly associate propositions with parties on the social liberal left and negative polarities with the conservative right. Big wow, this is very intuitive, but at least we've identified it causally, right? Importantly, individual respondents do not believe that parties are actually very pro. When you look at the space from the 0.5 line, which is essentially the anti or pro threshold, it's not the case that individuals view Labour or the Greens as dramatically very favourable, right? Or those on the part, where it's more the case that they view those on the right as more anti than they view those who are pro as more pro. The main hypothesis, of course, is that there's variation between the two groups. So the blue line here is those who identify as queer. The black line is those who identify as non-queer, and this is the difference in the marginal means, which is the estimate that we should consider for subgroup variation in conjoint analyses. There's no significant variation between the two groups. So while both groups view the party labels as strong signals of being pro or anti-queer, they don't do it at an asymmetric rate. What we do find, however, is that the spread that individuals perceive between parties is significantly larger for queer individuals than non-queer individuals. i.e., when queer individuals come to the political marketplace, they view the diversity of options available compared to anti-queer or pro-queer as being larger than the spread of positions available perceived by heterosexual individuals. Looking at this now, I wish we did have a booster sample of queer individuals in the conjoint, because lots of these coefficients are clearly theoretically congruent or just not statistically significant. We thought that in the conjoint setting, the power wouldn't be a problem, but if you were to ask me what do I believe to be the case, that there are genuine asymmetries in the population, and these are just insignificant coefficients, I would lean towards that definition. But this is what the data tells us, so come with that interpretation as you will. So we know that individuals, when they go to the political marketplace, assume, in the absence of concrete information about queer politics, that certain parties are more pro or negative, right? So far congruent with the spatial model. What we want to know is that when we provide information which might confirm or reject these kind of priors that individuals have, is how individuals respond. So the vignette experiment you're going to see in a second rely on the values from the conjoint. So in the conjoint, there were other values like the class background, education, past voting preferences, age, gender, and race. And we used their maximal perceived liberal values or maximum perceived conservative values to create two vignettes. A very, very liberal Labour MP and a very, very conservative MP. And we present this in the first stage. This is in a brand new survey. Here we do have a booster sample of queer individuals. And we randomly present respondents with one of these profiles, right? A very, very conservative MP and a very, very liberal Labour MP. And we ask respondents their voting intentions. This is in stage one. After this, after we've first recorded them, we then provide them with a new treatment in which we expose the MP's position as being pro-queer or anti-queer. Yeah? We can do two different analyses. The first is within individual change, i.e. if you're exposed to the Labour MP and you now learn that the Labour MP is pro, there shouldn't be much change, right? Because you've inferred before that Labour is pro. If, however, you were exposed to Labour in the previous round, but now learn that this MP's position is negative, your preferences should change dramatically if you're queer, right? Because you assumed this individual was going to vote for you, and now you've been informed that they're going to vote against you. This MP should suffer a negative penalty. And the reverse for the Conservatives, right? If you're queer, you assume that the Conservative MP is going to vote against you in Parliament. But if we inform you that they actually have a liberal position on your group's welfare, this should increase your preferences, right? So that's the within individual comparison we can do. We can ultimately do a between individual comparison, which is amongst all of these individuals, you're going to be in the end in one of four groups. You're going to be in the pro-gay or anti-gay Conservative, or you're going to be in the pro-gay or anti-gay Labour, in which case we can compare what would a queer individual do when they're presented with a Conservative MP who votes for them and a Labour MP who votes against them, and in this comparison, where would the queer vote go? If the spatial model does explain their political distinctiveness, they should go with the pro-queer Conservative, right? I'm not saying that's normatively good. I'm just saying theoretically that's what would happen from this model. So this is it. Yeah.
That's vignette, right?
This is vignette. Yeah.
So they're not actually facing two choices.
They're not facing two choices.
They're just facing one each time.
Yeah. So we just do a comparison of means between the treatment groups for the between individual comparison. So this is an example of the very conservative MP. So this guy, John, was in the armed forces. He's very religious. He's very Catholic. He voted negatively on lots of economic issues, voted negatively on lots of conservative issues, wants to decrease taxes and all the rest of it, right? There's a mirror image of this, which is a very pro-liberal Labour MP. This is stage one, self-reported probability to vote amongst queer individuals, amongst non-queer individuals, whether they were presented with the Labour MP in blue or the Conservative MP in black, right? Amongst both groups, the Conservative MP suffers an electoral penalty. Some context here, this was fielded in the very last months of the sitting Conservative government, which had record low approval ratings. So there's generally in the population going to be a large negative reaction towards the Conservatives in general. Second caveat is that John was exceptionally conservative, right? So even among some centre-right heterosexuals, there would be kind of a negative predisposition towards this individual because even for them, he might have unpalatable positions. So the treatment effect of Labour position is positive in both groups, but this is a significant variation based on heterosexuality, right? So queer individuals are 50%, 56% more likely or the treatment effect is 56% greater amongst queer individuals than non-queer individuals, right? So far, so good. This is kind of congruent with what observational data tells us. Labour has a premium compared to heterosexual individuals. This is the high information environment, right? So we now tell individuals we're going to tell them more information about John. We say that he has, despite him saying he's moderate, he has negative voting record on these issues. He said in interviews that he would vote against, hypothetically, a number of different issues that are likely to take place in time. So this is the results based on the left. This is queer individuals. On the right, this is non-queer individuals. There's a red line that's dashed called baseline. Now, baseline is not observed. Baseline is based on pre-treatment outcomes being exactly symmetrical to post-treatment outcomes, i.e., you said your probability to vote in the first stage was 5, and in the second round it's 5, right? But everyone received treatment, so this is a hypothetical counterfactual, right? Control indicates that they were shown a position congruent with the party, i.e., you were shown Labour in round 1, and then you were then told they were pro-gay. There's no information shock, right? Treatment means you were shown Labour in round 1, but now exposed to an anti-position, yeah? Or the reverse for the Conservatives. So far, so good? Yeah? If treatment did nothing, all of the slopes would follow the baseline. So if we look at LGBT individuals first, the control and the baseline are essentially parallel trends, right? If you're queer and you were shown a Conservative or Labour that has a position later on congruent with what you assumed, you don't do anything. You don't change your views, right? There's no within individual change. If you're exposed to treatment, however, that is, you now learn that the Conservative is pro-queer and the Labour is anti-queer, you see significant variation. If you hated them before, you now like them. If you loved them before, you now really, really hate them, yeah? Amongst non-queer individuals, the pattern is the same, but I want you to focus on the black control line in the baseline as self-reported probability to vote increases. Basically, if you really loved the Labour candidate before and you're heterosexual, but you now learn that the Labour candidate is pro-queer, you exhibit a penalty on them. So for Labour candidates, explicitly coming out in favour of pro-LGBT positions actually causes with them an electoral penalty amongst heterosexual individuals, which makes sense, right? If we think about the median voter of the Labour Party in the UK, whilst a lot of them will have socio-liberal values, there will be a significant, non-trivial proportion of that population who actually might have a liberal values on this question. So there's this variation here, which suggests that, you know, being explicitly pro if you're Labour amongst heterosexual might cause you with a penalty. Perhaps congruent with what we know about kind of prospect theory and negativity anchoring or negativity bias, the penalty for being incongruent when you previously liked them is significantly greater than the reward you give them. So this is another way of visualizing the same data. This is treatment effect conditional on the stage 1 randomization that you had and whether you were queer or not. Everyone penalizes Labour for being anti-queer. Queer individuals reward Conservatives for being pro-queer, and heterosexual individuals don't respond in any way, right? i.e. they don't reward or punish Conservatives for having congruent or incongruent positions. So this is within individual change, yeah? Comparing pre-treatment outcomes to post-treatment outcomes when I randomize whether positions shown are congruent or not, updates, individuals actively update their own valuations. The final comparison we can do is between individuals. So this is if we compare the voting intentions of individuals shown a pro-gay Conservative or an anti-gay Labour individual, which are they more likely to vote for? And they're more likely to vote for the pro-queer Conservative than the anti-gay Labour Party, right? This is these comparisons here. If the MP shown as pro-gay and they're Conservative, queers are, gosh, I can't even see this myself. I think it's 3.6. And if they're anti-queer and Labour, it's 2.16. So in a kind of responsive spatial model, you're more likely to vote for the party that advocates your group's welfare, even if they're very, very, very conservative on a large number of other different dimensions manipulated in the conjoint. It's also worth mentioning, however, that like the baseline probabilities here are low, right? It's not that we're comparing individuals who have like a 6 and a 7. if you were to poll a random individual on the street, they're still very unlikely to vote for this political party, but there's still significant and sizable variation between the two. So to wrap up, hopefully more or less on time, there's a theory that queer individuals vote like their rights depended on it, or vote for those that vote for them. And if that was the case, we would expect three assumptions to hold true: is that they have strong associational relationships between political parties and positions on this dimension in the absence of explicit information, that they update their voting intentions in response to information signals, and that ultimately, when there's a trade-off between different issue positions that might not be congruent with another, they would prefer the pro-queer right-wing individual than the anti-queer left-wing individual, which allows us to get around this observational data problem of issue bundling between lots of different dimensions. Two experiments, I hope, have been able to convince you that these three assumptions hold. What does this tell us about the political distinctiveness of queer individuals or political party competition more broadly? So the welfare maximizing model, or voting like your rights depended on it theory, is kind of empirically confirmed by these models. Again, I want to caveat that strongly by saying I don't believe there's a monocausal relationship about why queer individuals are politically distinct, but that supply-side competition or variation between political actors advocating illiberal or liberal policy positions does influence their electoral choices. And what this means for party competition, I think this might enter in like a normative question about what's desirable, because I guess you could say, should there be a queer voter gap or not, or should queer individuals just vote like everybody else? We know from actual turnout data or participation data that they vote significantly more than others in the population, which signals they view more at stake in democracy, hence higher levels of political participation. It's also the case that we shouldn't associate that the positive association between queer individuals and the social liberal left is necessarily like given, i.e. they can move their electoral preferences over time as parties change position. I actually think that is normatively good, even if it might favour parties we dislike, because if we believe that voters are able to hold parties to account or make parties be responsive, then they should be able to punish or reward parties for changing positions in ways that are either desirable or undesirable for those individuals. I did mention it a couple of times, but I think these results also signal a potential dilemma for social democratic parties like Labour, because whilst they are able to maximise support almost monolithically amongst a small but not trivial size of the electorate, doing so doesn't come without costs. As I've shown you, like being explicitly pro-LGBTQ+ does have some electoral detriment for specific groups amongst the population. And with that, I'll wrap it up and look forward to your questions.